Going to be so smooth.
Sorry.
We'll bring in our next guest, and we're going to talk about a study on media bias that was done recently by the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. Carrie wrote about that on the website. You've been busy writing, girl. That's not your article, but
that's about the study. Yeah, we can pull up the study That's the study, and then on the website, go to bold.global.
Where she claims, not proves, but claims.
This was an analysis.
Yeah.
I said that the report in some ways reinforces what Steve Bannon said, which is that the media in many ways is the opposition party. So let's bring our guest and get his perspective on this. Nicco Mele, the director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. Nicco, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Pleasure to be on your show.
Yep, great to have you back on. I remember you were a fellow there when I was a student, so it's good to see you again.
Good to see you too, fine alumna.
So just give us a brief rundown for those folks who aren't familiar with the study. What is it? What was the study? It was over the first 100 days of Trump's
Sure. Well, this is actually our fifth study. We looked at the presidential campaign season as well as the first 100 days of Trump. This one in particular is just about the first 100 days of Trump. And we look at some of the major players in media like the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, NBC, Fox, Wall Street Journal, and try and assess what are they covering, how might you rate or score the tone of that coverage, and what are the subjects they're covering. So, for example, in our campaign coverage, looking at the general election, we saw very little coverage of any issues. Almost all the coverage was about polling and scandal for both candidates. In the first 100 days of Trump's study, I think two of the major findings is that the coverage is really overwhelmingly negative for Trump, although that has some historical precedent. Bill Clinton's first 100 days is overwhelmingly negative as well. George W. Bush and Obama both got more balanced coverage in their first 100 days. And the other kind of key thing we looked at is who do they quote in these stories? And they overwhelmingly quote Trump. 65% of the time, Donald Trump's quoted. I believe Democrats are quoted about 6% of the time, and congressional Republicans 4% of the time. And
How is that different?
All Trump all the time.
How is that different from previous studies then for other presidents as far as quotes? Do you have data on?
We have some of that data. I'm not sure we have the exact. We don't have exactly comparable data. But one data we do have for other presidents is how much of the total news coverage the first 100 days was about the president. And in the case of Trump, it was, I believe, 41% of the total news coverage was about Donald Trump. That includes like the Cavaliers, right? Includes all news coverage. And that is unprecedented. It's almost triple what most of his predecessors saw. He is getting a giant volume of coverage.
And so do you think that in some ways, so this was, I think, the fascinating thing on the campaign trail was that Trump was getting a lot of negative coverage from the mainstream, quote unquote, press. But for his supporters, it actually ended up being sort of this martyr complex, stoking the flames to say, this is our guy. And the fact that you're being so negative on him, it makes us love him even more.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that's also how Hillary Clinton supporters feel. And in fact, our study of the general election showed that the coverage of both candidates was overwhelmingly negative. The media had nothing positive to say about either candidate.
Is there not? Does that? Go ahead. Sorry.
That's also true. That's also, as we see, true of most U.S. presidents get really negative coverage from the media.
Is that not? Did that not allow people to make a pretty strong argument that the issue is not necessarily bias so much towards or against a president, but bias towards the negative in general? And I think that people might argue that ratings are better when you can talk about something in the negative, where you can anger a viewer, where you can be the opposition. I think people would argue that. Is that not an issue?
It's really clear that the media has a major bias towards the negative. And it also has remarkably few ways of telling a story, right? And in the case of Trump, it's a very antagonistic way of telling the story that's all about Trump. There are no other voices in the conversation. And that's troubling. And I think it's especially troubling when you figure the presidency is just one of three branches of government. but with someone like Trump leading it, it's incredibly compelling, makes great television, as they say. And I tend to think that the values of the media are not the values of democracy.
Well, and Nicco, and to that point, so when we say that inherently there is sort of this confrontational relationship between an administration and the press, isn't that the structural way it should be? And I got to say, as a former Politico reporter, I think for Capitol Hill, for example, that isn't the case. You have so many journalists who are like best man or bridesmaids for people that they're supposed to be covering, and literally people are in bed with each other. I don't think that really happens on Capitol Hill very much. But I mean, do you think there's a way to mitigate? I mean, shouldn't that be that way in terms of being skeptical?
Certainly, arguably the first job of the press is to hold power accountable. And part of what you see in the negative coverage is actually a bias towards accountability. But I also think the press has a real obligation to tell a broader range of stories.
Let me ask a question about that, because you say a bias towards accountability, and I just want to ask from a very technical point. How do you determine what is negative? Just give us an idea of what.
So the methodology is we identify who the major player in the story is. It's called the newsmaker. Who's the newsmaker? Mm-hmm. And so in a story about the president, Trump is the newsmaker. And then we evaluate the story. If you were Donald Trump, how would you perceive this story? Would you perceive it as negative, positive, or neutral? That's how we do. That's how the methodology works.
But that's somewhat subjective.
It's somewhat subjective, but media in many ways makes that very easy.
And so when you say bias towards accountability, explain that to me too, because are you saying that the media is going above and beyond to try to be antagonistic, to try to be negative, or to just try to be impartial?
I think I wouldn't say bias towards accountability. I'd say it's a bias towards a negative coverage, that negative headlines, negative stories tend to perform better. I believe that the press's main job is accountability, holding power accountable, and sometimes that leads to more negative stories when you're bringing accountability and saying, well, that's not exactly what the data shows, or that's not exactly what happened.
Are there any studies that show? I'm curious. Maybe y'all have done or will do one that show how ratings for a network may or may not perform based on whether the coverage is negative or positive. Fox News has lost quite a bit of ground in the past few months, and some might argue that's because they've had a harder time being anti-something than MSNBC has had being anti right now.
Maybe you'll have me back on your show in a couple of weeks when we release a study in that vein. We look at the Sunday morning political shows and compare the topics and the guests to Nielsen ratings.
Maybe we'll have you back, and maybe you should come here and deliver that study here first. What do you think?
Breaking news, yes, exclusive, bold exclusive.
Thank you, Nicco, for joining us. I think it's fascinating. It's a discussion we have a lot on this show about media bias in general, and it's nice to have some. I would say Harvard's pretty impartial. Some nice unbiased data to help guide that discussion.
Carrie was a student here.
Trust me, she tells us all the time.
Whatever, Clay.
And she's not biased at all, right?
Never.
Nicco, thank you very much for joining us, Nicco Mele from Shorenstein Center at Harvard. So did that justify some of your beliefs? How did you feel about it?
Well, I liked the point that he made, that this is sort of inherently structurally part of what journalism is. But I think that the sense from a lot of Trump supporters is that it's unprecedented, the level of negativity versus other administrations.
Well, some progressives would argue, well, don't give us so much material then. I don't disagree that there's a lot more negative coverage of Trump, but I might make the argument that it's a justifiable amount of coverage that he wouldn't be satisfied with. So I think, do better and we won't be so upset.
But also the fact that was interesting that he talked about that the coverage was Trump in his own words. That was,
right,
I think,
the quotes. You can't be biased if you're quoting the man.
Or I guess the follow-up I would ask to him next time we have him on is, when he has it in his own words, but then how are you interpreting those words? Because I think that's the issue
It's
too.
very difficult. It's all just a big covfefe. How do you interpret some of those words, right?
Yes.
Karen? You want to, let's go on
That's
to our
rosy
next-
colored glasses. We'll do that
We
next
should
week.
do that.
Yes.